Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 332. Is Judaism Mosaic or Mosaic? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And this episode marks the last episode of our fiscal year. And that means that if you were planning to make a donation to Judaism Unbound this year, now is the time to do it because our fiscal year closes June 30th. And it's really helpful for us to have your support, which we really need at this time of year, but also it's really important to signal to other funders that the folks who listen to Judaism Unbound are really invested in it and care about it. So it's not important how much you give. And in fact, if you give $7 or more, you will be entered into a raffle where all kinds of valuable things are on offer, including Judaism Unbound merch and also a free Unyeshiva class of your choosing next year. And also any gifts totaling up to $10,000 will be matched by a generous donor. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of your support indicates to other donors how much our community of listeners cares about this podcast and everything that we're doing. And so your gift will be doubled. So if you are willing, able, ready, please go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate and make your donation. Why don't you pause this episode right now, go ahead and make that donation, and then come right back. We'll still be here. So, Lex, we had a really exciting thing that happened, I guess it's 2 weeks ago or so now, which was Shavuot Live. And that was our 24 or 25-hour Shavuot extravaganza?
No, 24. Nice, rhythm of 24 hours in a day, 24 hours of Shavuot Live. Yep.
It feels like it should have been a multiple of 7. It should have been 28. Anyway, Yeah, Shrita, we blew it. Anyway, we didn't blow it other than that because it was really an extraordinary experience. And Lex, that was all you. I mean, I actually was at my college reunion this year, so I was even less involved than usual in Shavuot Live. And you just did an amazing thing. So I just thought I wanted to kick it right to you to talk about your sense of not only the event, because we're not here to just celebrate our event. I think that we both agree that something happened there that is significant to the stuff that we've been talking about all these years.
Yeah. Shavuot Live was fire. Shavuot Live was incredible, and it's been incredible in past years. But, I kept on saying this to my wife and to people in attendance and to others, something happened. Whatever Shavuot Live has been, whatever this 24-hour Jewish learning extravaganza has been in past years, we turned a corner and became something. I don't just want to say bigger. It's not just that there were more people. There actually were some more people. We had over 1,000 folks who tuned in real time to participate. It was also that the kinds of conversations that were happening were really, really incredible. This was important for the Jewish collective. I really think that. And it's not that we're here to pat ourselves on the back. There are also other digital kinds of Shavuot observances that I would include in this that is important for the Jewish collective. But I think there's something happening with Shavuot where, to a great degree, it is a digital holiday in 2022. Now, that's putting aside that there are certain groups of Jews who would understand Shavuot as being a holiday where you can't use computers. That's not us. And it's not many, many, many thousands of people who have shown up to these different events. But when you've got 1,000 people participating in our event, and by the way, a huge number of those people, the average length of attendance was almost 4 hours. So you have hundreds and hundreds of people who spent many hours. There were some people who stayed for 15 hours of our 24. And there was me who, of course, did all 24 because I'm not really a reasonable human being. We covered so much ground. We talked about some sort of classic Shavuot materials, talking about, what happened on Mount Sinai and 10 Commandments and those things, Revelation. But we also veered into Jewish pop culture, and we journeyed into poetry, and we journeyed into stories, and we had a few sessions of just kind of like pop-up bring your own Torah, where participants shared their own stories in Torah and etc. This was a collaborative, incredible moment for people to share a love for just learning stuff with other people together. And I know that for me, I actually left the event a kind of high. Like, I felt like Shavuot did what it's supposed to do. Like, you're supposed to feel like you're ascending up Mount Sinai, right? Receiving this revelation. And I felt that. Part of that was, like I said, I was up 24 hours, and I think my body actually chemically is altered when I stay up for that long consecutively. But I don't know, like, for those of you who are in attendance, which is a lot of you who are listening, I hope you understand that you are shaping Judaism through that experience. Like, Shavuot is a critical core holiday. It has been for a long time in many different ways. But basically, recognize that you played a key role in shaping what Judaism is and what it can be, because nothing like this has ever happened until the last 3 years. It's never happened. And one thing I've really been sitting with lately is, like, people sometimes think when they talk to me that I have no sense of like obligation or boundary because I work for an organization called Judaism Unbound. But I actually do, and I feel the need to say this, like, I feel a deep sense of obligation to to Judaism or to the Jewish collective or to the Jewish past, present, and future, which is that I think every generation is obligated, like must bring its own unique vantage point, Torah, wisdom, stories to the Jewish, chain of tradition. Like, if our 21st century era of Judaism does not create new, beautiful holidays and texts and stories and ideas that will matter in 1,000 or 2,000 years, then we've failed. And so if we're only preserving stuff that we've inherited, then we're actually missing one of our core obligations, which is to come up with those teachings, stories, texts that are going to matter for thousands of years. By the way, I really hope that climate change doesn't so thoroughly erase all of humanity that there is actually Judaism in 1,000 or 2,000 years. But I hope that people recognize that Shavuot Live is a contribution to that obligation, that I feel like we really are doing something. And I say we, lots of organizations talk in we voice, and they say, oh, we, blah, blah, blah. Like, really, each person who came to this, who commented in the chat, we have over 170 pages of size 10-point font, single-spaced chat from this event. Like, everybody who came and created something in the chat, everybody who unmuted and spoke up, everybody who presented, there's a real way in which the story of Shavuot will be different because of you. I actually think that. And once again, it's not just Shavuot Live. It's the general set of digital observances that are taking this holiday online in a way that I think is also true of other holidays, but maybe extra true of Shavuot. So I'm just grateful to everyone for that.
I was thinking as you were talking, like, wow, I usually don't like to get so self-congratulatory on the podcast about things that we've done. I mean, we tend to see this as a platform to share what everybody's doing and to encourage lots of people to do all kinds of experiments. And that's what Shavuot Live also is. And you just described how it is. But to really think about, like you said, this has never happened before. And I was curious about, like, what the this is when you say that. Not necessarily asking you, I'd love for you to weigh in. But I mean, when I'm thinking about what the this is that's never happened before, I think the idea of observing Shavuot as a 24-hour process, as opposed to the previous version of Shavuot for like the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the Shavuot study session, is like, a number of hours. And the expectation is that most people would be there the whole time. And somehow our small community, our local synagogue, whatever our small community is, we have this event and maybe a few dozen people come and they're there all night, and most of the people don't come, and it's like any other Jewish holiday experience. But here, this is something really new. This is a 24-hour, it's going on all the time, with the exception of you, who is insane. Everybody is expected to be going to sleep at some point during that 24. Nobody is expected to be there the whole time. I personally went to sleep in the middle of it, And I had it going on my phone partly because I felt like responsible since I'm I'm part of the team here, that I should kind of somehow be engaging with it. But I was at my college reunion and I got very tired and I had to go to sleep, but I left it on. And I woke up a few times during the night. And I woke up and like it was happening and people are studying Torah around me and I'm like sleeping and I'm waking up. It was this weird experience. The idea that there's this 24-hour Shavuot happening, that at any moment that I have a break, I can just switch gears, put in my earphones. It's with me. It's playing. I can do Shavuot for 36 minutes and then go back to a thing. Or I can have one earphone in my ear and I can be half doing Shavuot and half listening to whatever's going on at my reunion. That was something that I think didn't exist before. And the question for me is like, what does that mean in terms of, so we had 1,000 people come. How many Jews are there in the world? 15 million? I mean, I could imagine that something, not necessarily our version, but if 24-hour digital Shavuot becomes the norm, you can start to imagine that experience is profoundly accessible to hundreds of thousands of people every Shavuot, if not more. And it becomes normative to say, like, Shavuot is occurring all the time and I can tune in and out as I can. It also feels like it potentially starts to open the door to a cool way of experiencing Judaism on every holiday and every Shabbat or every day. Our intern, Eli, recently wrote an article that was amazing in New Voices magazine about how they are experiencing Wednesdays as a Jewish day now. And it's like, well, why not Thursday, right? Why not Tuesday? If it's happening all the time, then you can bring Judaism with you whenever you need it. And that becomes a different way to imagine what Judaism looks like.
Yeah, I want to bring up another thing that I think we're so in it that we don't even name it. We've used the word Torah a bunch. And I think somebody who looked at the topics that we explored in Shavuot Live, they might actually be confused. And I don't mean confused in like a disapproving way. They might actually just not get what we mean, because a bunch of the sessions, like we had people come and talk about a film that's coming out related to American Jews and how they relate to Israel-Palestine. We had people talk about an organization that does philanthropic work and thinking about Jewish philanthropy. We had people, academics, who came and spoke that they were actually talking about like Shavuot's history, but it wasn't necessarily the kind of texts or sources that one tends to see in like a quote unquote Torah study or in the margins of a Chumash, which is to say like a book that has the 5 books of Moses and various commentators in it. Like, we're the commentators. I actually believe that we're at a point, and maybe we've always been at this point, but we haven't always said it, where the wisdom that people bring to Jewish life is itself Torah. And it doesn't need to have a stamp of approval of like being the Tanakh. It doesn't need to be the book of Esther or be the book of Song of Songs or be the book of Exodus. And I'd say like 50-50, the sessions sort of looked like classical quote unquote Torah. Like what's interesting, Dan, like your session actually was one of the closer traditionalist notions of what a Torah story was. You took us through a bunch of different sections of the Bible. That's very much like what is happening at lots of synagogues all over the place. What I think is the next stage or next level of, for me, what Shavuot could be, but also what Judaism could be, is saying we're not going to stop at those books, those pieces of Jewishness, Judaism that have been marked, authorized as official. We're gonna look to texts that weren't made official. I mean, I did mine on the Book of Jubilees, which didn't make it into the canon. We're gonna talk about TV shows like Russian Doll, which was a session. We're gonna talk about organizations that are not texts in any sense other than like they are manifestations of Jewish wisdom and people. And for me, what it is to experience revelation, that's the word that Shavuot is generally associated with. It's just to learn stuff. It's just to learn something new. And this is where the unbound part of Judaism Unbound really comes in. Like, I don't want there to be a box around the set of things that count, quote unquote, as Torah or as revelation or as Judaism. And so I'm very happy that this experience sort of without, and we didn't say at the beginning of every session, we think that this thing is Torah. We just sort of did the thing. And when you just do the thing and you experience a bunch of different things as a level of sacred that we ascribe to Torah, all of a sudden our entire mindset of what it is to experience holiness and to experience Judaism changes. And I very much want that change.
I think that B'nai Lappi and I may have talked about this last year on Shavuot Live, but we've been working out how to rethink about the myth of Sinai for the next iteration of Judaism. And one of the things that occurred to us over time is that the myth of Sinai has constantly been changing, such that I think the original Sinai story was probably just the burning bush. And then at a later point, the story got added onto that the Ten Commandments were given on Mount Sinai. And then later it was added that it was the whole Torah was given on Mount Sinai. And then later the rabbis kind of add to them and say, actually, there was also an oral Torah given on Mount Sinai. And that was never written down. And now we're writing that down. So what's interesting is that myth, which Shavuot, at least the version that we have today, is kind of built around the myth of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, that there's actually this room to expand that myth, and that myth does expand in every iteration of Judaism, and it expands in the way of saying, like, there were more elements of Torah given, and it feels to me like what an event like Shavuot Live, the way that you're describing it, where it's not just people talking at people, but people are invited to bring their own Torah in. Some of those are formal speakers who are invited, who are not like Jewish professionals, and they're invited to share their ideas. But there were hours, like you were talking about, where people just talked, and brought their own ideas who were there. People who were attending were invited to share their ideas and their thoughts and their Torah. There's this expansion of what the revelation of Torah means. I think rather than the way that often, especially some of us who grew up more religious, were taught to experience Shavuot as kind of a reenactment of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, but when we're reenacting that, we're in the role of the people, and the people are standing at the foot of the mountain, and we're just kind of absorbing what other, higher ups are sending down to us. But I think this is a reenactment of of that myth, where we, the people, are actually in the role of Moses, or maybe even God, and are saying, like, no, the revelation is happening directly to us, or maybe we are the source of the revelation. And so you can kind of like hold on to the myth and to say, yeah, this is still about Sinai, but the characters are changing, right? Or we're inhabiting a different character. And in my session, like, it's interesting because one of the things that's really surfaced for me over the course of the last semester, where we were doing deep dives into everything that the Bible has to say about the Jewish holidays, was that there are 4 books in the Torah, right? There's not much in the book of Genesis or anything about the holidays. In Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you will see many of the holidays discussed in each of those books, and they are discussed in profoundly different ways. Sometimes they have different names. Often they have different practices or different justifications. And those of us who were taught in a kind of traditional setting were kind of taught to not see those distinctions in the different books and to see the Torah as a unified whole, and to see, like, okay, yeah, so part of Shavuot is written about in this book and part of it is written about in this book, but you have to take them together to understand what the, quote, biblical version of Shavuot was. And when you look at it that way, you understand that after the temple was destroyed, the rabbis reinvented Judaism and they changed things. So that happened once. And then you say, oh, and we're living in another time when that should happen. And you're like, well, what are the odds that you live in just the second time that something like that would be called for? Like, probably low. Everybody thinks they live in some really important time of great change. So, odds are we're wrong and we should stick with the tradition. That's kind of what a lot of people say. When you look at the Torah and you see that actually within the Torah itself, we're looking at 4 or 5 versions of every holiday, and that we can see the way that these holidays have evolved and changed within the Torah itself, which really called to mind for me Andrew Tobolewski's idea that we see the tribes of Israel stuff happening within the Bible itself. And then later, when other people refer back to the 10 tribes traditions, they're actually doing something that we've always been doing, as opposed to some kind of, thing that they're trying to like take some idea, cultural appropriation or whatever from Judaism. When we look at the holidays that way and we see that we can see like 5 turns of the wheel within the Torah itself, and then we say, oh, the rabbis, that wasn't the second, that was the 6th. And then we can kind of look deeper
time
into
that there's been changed, just to really clarify.
Yeah, the sixth time it's been changed.
Yeah.
And then
or the 11th, like the number doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Yeah.
Right, but not the second. And then we can kind of look at within Rabbinic Judaism, then we start to look, and B'nai and I do this on the Oral Talmud, and it could be beyond the Talmud. You actually realize there's not one rabbinic version of these holidays. There's 10 rabbinic versions. The idea of the Shavuot all-night study session was a very late rabbinic invention, by the Kabbalists. So once you see that, then you say, oh, wow, we've probably had like 10 or 15 or 20 turns of the wheel already. So all we're saying is that we want to do the 21st. That seems to be a much more easy to sell idea than we want to do the third. Or the second turn of the wheel. Shavuot Live is one of those turnings of the wheel. That's very exciting to me.
Really into this on a bunch of levels. I want to share one of my more recent word plays I've been futzing around with. There's a word that I am really interested in. The word is mosaic. It's a fascinating word for a few reasons. One, it's both a noun and an adjective, without having to change it at all. It's not like a word that you can add an ending and it becomes an adjective. It's actually both a noun and an adjective. The noun mosaic, and by the way, I know listeners that you know this. I'm just saying it aloud to create this framework. The noun mosaic is an art form where you have a bunch of different pieces or tiles that each are sort of independent, but they're put together to create a picture or a visual that is a broader whole. That's the noun mosaic. And then there's also the adjective mosaic with a capital M, which sometimes Christians talk about more than Jews, but like Mosaic law, the 5 books of Moses, mosaic meaning Moses-y, like in the manner of Moses. I really want to mess around with whether we might actually understand those two terms, the noun mosaic, the art thing, and the adjective mosaic, the Moses-y thing, as talking to each other or commenting on each other. And what I mean by that is, what if the Mosaic law, quote unquote, like the 5 books of Moses, are to be understood as a mosaic, as a patchwork of a bunch of different small pieces that become a broader whole? I'm not the only one who's thought this way, right? Like, people have been talking about the documentary hypothesis and how there's different sources that make the Torah, but I actually think I'm saying something that's more than that. It's not just that there's like J, E, P, D, H. Like, it's not just that there's like 4 or 5 particular sources that are placed together. It's that there's a whole slew of cultural practices and traditions and discussions and holiday markers and whatever that different groups are doing at different times, and like little snippets of each are making their way into this final text. And I say that not to be like a heretic, not to say this thing is just sort of human made and not interesting. It's just a random smorgasbord of stuff. I want to say it's a mosaic. Like, it actually does create a broader, beautiful, incredible whole, W-H-O-L-E. And once we understand that, once again, there's an obligation. Like, we each can be like contributing a tile to what this thing is. Because what is the Torah? It's actually not one full product. It's like it's a patchwork of a bunch of little contributions from different small groups in different places, in different time periods, that mushed together to become something coherent. And I do think that now we can experience it as coherent, even if it wasn't, organized that way. So that actually gets me to think about art, because you could argue from that, like, oh, everybody should be writing their Devar Torah. Like, everybody should be writing their sermon about what Judaism should be, and like, then they'll mush together and become some big whole. Like, that's not what I think happened with the Torah, or especially with the Bible beyond the Torah. What happened was people told a bunch of stories and came up with a bunch of mythologies. And once again, mythology not in the derisive way, but in the like beautiful sacred myths that bond people to one another. And then, some of those collided with other nearby mythologies. Then we had a new thing, and then we had a new direction about what the holiday, like that's what this process was. And so if it's just a collision of a bunch of stories and mythologies, then we need to look to stories, which is to say to art, fiction writing, film, television, poetry. Those are the tools that will be brought into a toolbox that could be like the next iteration of Torah.
Yeah, I love what you said about mosaics. Actually, while you were talking, I was looking up, what's the etymology of mosaic? And Wikipedia does say that technically the etymology flows from muses, from the word muse.
Oh, cool.
But I love what you're doing with it because, first of all, that's exactly what the rabbis constantly do in the Talmud, and right, is that they make associations between Hebrew words and Aramaic words and other languages words that actually are not related, but they sound similar, and they make all kinds of amazing interpretations out of that. Much of Judaism is flowing from these interpretations. So I think that's fantastic, and I love the idea that that Moses is a mosaic in the sense that you're saying that the story, in other words, you're saying that there are all these little parts and they get kind of mushed together. And at some point, maybe because of the intention of how they were mushed together, and maybe it was not intentional, you can see a larger picture. But the larger picture was actually not the source of the small parts. It was actually made up of the small parts.
Exactly.
And when we look historically at how many things, including Judaism, came to be, they come to be through this accumulation of small parts. And then, for some reason, somebody wants to know, well, how did we get this? I mean, how did this happen? And so they make up a story of some genius that came up with all this stuff himself, or maybe got it revealed on a mountaintop. And
that's Moses. Yeah.
And that's Moses. And Moses is a mosaic in the sense that is a mythic story that was meant to kind of give us an easy way to kind of understand and then to build upon something that actually didn't happen that way historically. And just like a mosaic, it isn't hiding being made up of the small pieces.
Right.
That's actually fully visible. And sometimes you're taught not to see it, but if you actually start to look, you can see the seams and you can see the different tiles. And it becomes even cooler when you did. And sometimes you're like, how did they do that? How did they use, small tiles to make this experience all cohere? And I think the question of the art that we're seeing in some of our conversations, like Russian doll or pieces of theater art or other kinds of art that folks in the workshop are creating, or the stuff that's happening at the Fence Around the Torah exhibit at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, to some extent, what we're seeing are these new pieces that one day will be incorporated into a new mosaic. And when we see it that way, if revelation at Sinai is a myth through which we explain how all these little revelations that took place over centuries at some point kind of cohered and people made connective tissue between them, and they started to, I don't think people actually sat down and made connective tissue between them. I think it's like I've made this example of like a primordial soup where the molecules just crash into each other and sometimes they just stick together. If they stick together in a good way, then it kind of continues to work and then it becomes an organism over time. And then at some point somebody kind of says, hey, we've really got this amazing system that really works. How did it come to be? And they come up with this amazing myth of revelation at Sinai to explain it. Well, if you reverse engineer the myth, then you understand that the revelation actually was happening all the time in small ways. And so it's not that the revelation didn't happen. It's that the revelation didn't happen that way. And the revelation happened through these little small revelations. Then we can look at all of these pieces of art and more, and things that I consider art, but other people don't consider art, like new expressions of Judaism. Like, to me, that's a version of art. And we understand those as each of those is a little revelation. So when we look at something like Russian doll, which doesn't position itself as a piece of Jewish art, really, and that is, seen by some as low culture or, it's on Netflix, how arty can it be? Whatever, that actually it's both art, but it's also more than art, it's revelation. Like we're seeing something that may well be a piece of that larger mosaic down the road. And the last thing I'll say about it, which is maybe the most heretical thing of all, but I would surmise that the stuff that we now call the Torah, they didn't have TV in those days. They didn't have movies. This was what they had. They had storytelling, they had some books, and stuff. Like, it very well may be that the stories of Genesis, for example, were basically the Russian doll of that time, right? I mean, they were just like popular entertainment.
I don't think that's heretical at all. I mean, I think that's right. I think that that's absolutely what happened is, I mean, like, let's try to back out and ask, like, well, let's actually start with what is like pop culture and then work back to Torah. If I were to try and define what pop culture even is, I think what I would say is that it's a set of publicly available stories and melodies and visual creations, all sorts of other things that are available to everyone as a shared thing to talk about, basically, like something to enjoy life a little more, something that makes life richer, and also to some extent something that is meant specifically to provoke, like we talked about with Kendall Pinckney, to open up new conversations that might not already be apparent to us, but to push us to create a better world. Often art is doing that too. Pop culture even is doing that. I think we like to distinguish between like art on the one hand, the set of things in museums and in works of fiction, especially old ones. We like to distinguish between that and like, I don't know, low art, just sort of everyday songs that are on the radio. Those are just like sort of trashy, especially if they're extra popular. We actually don't like when things are popular because somehow that seems to point to like, they must not be that great if they're just accessible to everyone. But actually, I mean, this is a little bit like autobiographical in my own preferences in the world. Like, I actually feel, I was talking about obligation before. I actually feel like it's important for me as a human person to be in the loop about stories that are well known to a lot of humanity. Like, I actually feel like it's important for me to engage with Star Wars. Like, pick your famous thing that's out there, because what being engaged with Star Wars does is it allows me to have a pathway into connection with a large component of humans who I might not have an easy connection with otherwise. That's what pop culture does. That's what art does. And I think that's what Torah does. The whole point of these books, and that's why Genesis is about a family. Like, the whole point of this story is to create a set of connections between people who might not otherwise feel connected to each other. Like, the stories communicate a way for people across lines of difference, whether that's tribal differences of the 12 tribes or even broader differences. There's a mixed multitude in the Torah where lots of non-Israelites are still part of the story. Like, that's what stories do, is they create a pathway to do that. And so I, as a person, feel like I should know the latest pop music, even if I don't like all of it. And look, I get that there's downsides to this too. Like, by me focusing on the most mainstream pop things because I feel like I want to connect to lots of other people who listen to that, I'm missing lots of other things that are really great. But what I am interested in is a Judaism that functions similarly, where, like, to quote the Talmud, like, what are the people doing? One of the things that people are doing is they're watching Netflix. Talk to them, I promise you, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of them are experiencing some of what they do as a kind of Jewish experience. Now, do I think most people would call that Torah? No, I don't. I think mostly because we haven't encouraged them to yet. But it's parallel to what the Torah was. I mean, this gets really clear when you look at the writings section of the Torah, of the Tanakh, as opposed to the parts that are sort of one ongoing story of the Jewish people. When you get to the writings, it's like, here's a cool love poem. Erotic sex poetry. That's clearly functioning in society in a way comparable to like rom-coms, or honestly, you could argue pornography. Maybe that's the heretical thing I'll say today. It's functioning in an important way. And, you know, you throw it in a canon. You throw it in an official thing so that we can all relate to it and, you know, kibitz about what we think. You do the same thing with a book like Ecclesiastes, which is kind of depressing. There's plenty of depressing art. Like, I a few weeks ago, I compared Ecclesiastes to the song "Blowing in the Wind" by Bob Dylan. Like, it's not just that this stuff uplifts us. There's plenty of art that makes us feel sad and traumatized, and we need that too. And, you know, so we have Ecclesiastes in the canon. We have other things that are clearly stories written by other groups of people that are not Jews, that enough Jews liked, or Israelites liked, or Judahites liked, that it became part of our story because we wanted to be able to share that story with one another.
I think you've brought me around more and more to this feeling of, you know, that I think that I used to draw a sharper line between, you know, what you could call high culture and low culture, pop culture, you know, and say, well, It's not clear to me that pop culture is trying to be art in the sense that what I'm talking about, that it affects you and it moves you and it changes you. But sometimes you just don't know what will do that. And sometimes it may not, I'm always talking about how a Jewish innovation should not be judged at the time of its beginning because they grow up over time. It's like, You say, what does this crappy baby do? It doesn't do anything. And that baby is going to be Einstein, but like if you just judge it based on that right now, all it does is cry and poop, we all understand that that's absurd. So why do we do that with new Jewish ideas? And why do we do that with culture where we're going to mark something as a high culture or a low culture, or particularly marking it as low culture, before we even know what it can become? And there was a point at which the Bible was canonized. And somebody at some point made that decision, and then books like the Book of Jubilees or Ben Sirah became seen as like less than because they didn't make it into the Bible. But at the time that they were out, many people thought of them as more than. They were taken more seriously. They were more central. And so we don't even know what was high and what was low culture, back then, if that even matters. So what I want to add to it, though, is to understand that it's more than these kind of things are art. It's that they may actually be revelation, and that What would it be like if we understood that any person, any Jew, any person, any human being can experience revelation in their lives, but not the revelation, and it's probably not from God, but it's a revelation in the sense that anything prior to this has ever been a revelation, meaning it's the same quality of thought or idea or practice that has the potential to become central to a future version of Judaism, just as something that somebody thought of 2,000 years ago ended up being central to our Judaism. That could happen. There's no reason to think that that couldn't happen, and there's no reason to think that that couldn't happen about any given idea that anybody might have at any point. There's no reason to think that it will, but there's no reason to think that it won't. And so what would it look like if we took that seriously, the possibility that any idea that anybody has is potentially as significant as any other idea that we see as central as Judaism? I think that would create a radically different experience of being Jewish. To imagine that I might be a vehicle for revelation at any moment in time, and maybe I'm talking in a language that I usually don't like to talk in, because I don't so much like to talk about God and revelation and things, because these are not things that I believe in the theological way that many people hear it as. But sometimes they can work well as metaphors, and I'm talking about it in the metaphorical sense. But I think it's powerful to imagine a world in which we aren't looking to someone else to be the source of revelation, that could be us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking really practically about this. I'm thinking of like a typical synagogue down the road, wherever you are in the world. My one answer I have to your question of like, what would change if we thought every idea had the potential to be one of the tiles in the mosaic of Jewish future? We would look a lot closer at like the art projects the Sunday school kids do and put on the wall. If it's possible, and I do think this is possible, like if we actually were to look at the projects that, on Hanukkah, the 7-year-olds make some like pretty pictures related to Hanukkah. Like if we were to look at each of the pictures they drew and ask like, if this picture were centralized in our synagogue's Hanukkah program, what would happen? Is there something surprising in this? Is there some element of Hanukkah that this 7-year-old understands that either was already there and I wasn't noticing it, or it wasn't even there yet, but we're going to try it out with our candle lighting experiences? Like if we actually, and I get that this would be like exhausting if you did it for every single drawing by every single kid. If we did it even a little bit, that would be incredible. And, those 7-year-olds would feel like, wow, I matter to this community. Like it's not just that I go to a service and receive. I am actually being, and by the way, this could be 7-year-olds, it could be 17-year-olds, it could be 45-year-olds, it could be 85-year-olds, all of those.
Well, what I would say about the 7-year-olds is that actually exists. An institution like that already exists. And we had Rebecca Milder on from the Jewish Enrichment Center, and that's really how it is. So that question that you asked and that I'm asking, like, what would it be like if this was, at least for 7-year-olds, we actually know.
Yeah, and there are some organizations that do this a little bit with Bar Mitzvah, right? Like this is what we advocate for, and it's not yet common, but there are places where the conversation is, what is this 12 or 13-year-old's passion? Okay, we're going to shape and experience a Jewish communal event around that passion. We can do that at every stage of life and for every holiday and for everything. Like, we actually can do that. And I think it would be more exciting for us in our communities. We'd get a richer, a vaster array of contributions from different kinds of people. And it would send a message to everyone like, oh my gosh, it's like you're in the audience at The Price is Right. And you have the chance of being the name that gets called to go on stage.
Yeah, that's
why do people want to go to The Price is Right more than they want to go to other game shows?
Yeah.
Because you literally can be called up and win a bunch of money. Like, I don't want to conflate it too much with like making money. That's not what I'm communicating. It's not The Price is Right in every way.
But the point is, it could be you.
Exactly. That sense of, wow, I could be the one. And by the way, it's not just one. I could be one of, because this is what you said before, like we create this mythology of one genius. I could be one of hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people whose contribution actually moves the needle on what Judaism even is. That to me is exciting, and to be candid, it's more exciting than I get to be the next person who does the same ritual that my parents and their parents did. There are plenty of things in my life that I do in the way that my parents did, in the way that their parents did, or even in the way that my mythological ancestors did. But there's a magic to sensing that we could actually be the ones to create something. And the last thing I want to say about that is, this goes back to art again. Art, whether it's the 7-year-olds art, but especially when it's Jewish communal arts organizations, we talk about them as if they're like toppings on the sundae. They're not the sundae itself. They're nice add-ons to Judaism, but they're not Judaism. What the Jewish Museum does, or what the Jewish Arts Organization does, or what the Jewish storytelling does, is like, it's almost like a path in. It's like a means towards Judaism. If you're a funder and you're like looking to support one of these organizations, you might ask, like, does participation in your Jewish museum or your Jewish X lead to people then being more engaged in Judaism, celebrating more holidays, lighting candles, doing things that are classically seen as Judaism? We got to get past that and recognize that the art is actually the thing. Like, it's what we need. We need that 7-year-old and that 17-year-old and that 45-year-old and that 85-year-old to be creating the next iterations of what Judaism even is, not from scratch, but using wisdom from the past and using their own intuition, if we're going to be functioning at the level we should be.
The way that I would sort of gloss what you're saying is that, well, we should think of Judaism as being, and by the way, this is not necessarily at all times in history, but in our time in history, we should understand Judaism to be raw material out of which various things can be shaped. And we should be inviting many artists to reshape Judaism itself in ways that are artistic, and which I want to talk about in a minute, like what that means. But again, what would the world look like if we understood Judaism to be raw material rather than a finished thing? By the way, B'nai Lappi teaches this text, and off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what the source of it is, but it's some kind of like post-Talmudic midrash, I think. And it's the story of a king and his 2 servants. And the king basically gives each of them a bunch of flax and a bunch of flour, I think. And he comes back in like a year, and one person and he says to the people, can you give me back my flax and my flour? And one of the people just gives him back the same mound of flax and mound of flour. And the other person gives him like this suit and this bread that he's made. And the king prefers the suit and the bread. And he basically says to the other person, like, you think that when I gave you this stuff, I just wanted you to just hold on to it? And like, no, I wanted you to make something out of it. That's how you preserve something. That's how you make something worth preserving. And so the idea that this is like obvious about everything other than Judaism, I think. It's like, of course we wouldn't go to a museum if it was just full of like hunks of clay. And so at a point at which we see that Judaism is better understood as the material of art rather than as finished art, then of course the next move is to make new things out of it. Then I think we can look back at everything that's happened up till now, and all of a sudden it's fractal. All of a sudden we see that, yeah, it's all been a mosaic all the time, and it's all been, reshaped art all the time. There's no such thing as a static Judaism. That's always a misunderstanding of what it is. It's an organism. It's like imagining that a wax figure of me is the same as me, and this static Judaism is not Judaism.
Yeah, I'm coming to a teaching or an idea that I've heard very regularly in all sorts of different Jewish spaces, and which I've actually loved, but which I'm finding myself wanting to play with or shift, which is the idea that every Jew has a letter in the Torah. What that communicates is in the 5 books of Moses, in the text of those 5 books, with however many tens of thousands of letters, there's a letter that in some, whether it's metaphysical or spiritual or like some kind of interesting way, connects to each Jew. And I actually think that's a beautiful idea, that like every one of us can find ourselves in this text. But I kind of want to play with a shift where the teaching wouldn't be that each one of us has a letter of the Torah, like the scroll that's in the Ark, but rather the letter of the Torah that each one of us has is not in a scroll that is already written and in an Ark. It is in, and I apologize to the extent this sounds like woo-woo for people who don't love that, but like I mean it, I promise. I'm not just like spouting nonsense. Within each one of us, in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds, there is a letter. There is a potential for a contribution, which is to say a letter of Torah that would be contributed to our Jewish community now and to the Jewish future. If that's how we think about it, in every synagogue, in every Jewish community center, in everywhere, would of necessity have to be about how are we going to get the 15 million letters of Torah out of each person and into the world? Like, we actually have a responsibility collectively to make sure that we draw that Torah out of everyone. And not that we, quote unquote, engage people, not that we get every one of those 15 or whatever million people to participate in Jewish stuff. Because that's the paradigm that we don't want. That's like, there is Judaism already, and we need everybody to sign on, be in the room where it happens. No, we actually must take steps to make sure that every person who is a Jew by birth, every person who is a Jew by choice who converted, everybody who is a Jew in the United States, everybody who is a Jew in Europe, everybody who's a Jew in Africa, in Asia, in South America, like everywhere, we have to take steps so that their Torah can come out in the world. I didn't say come out there in the sense of coming out of the closet, but I actually don't hate that synchronicity. We had a lot of folks who identify as LGBTQ, majority actually, who presented as part of Shavuot Live. I think there's a way in which those folks have specific Torah out of the 15 million forms of Torah that is really important. But we gotta start looking to draw Torah out of people as opposed to getting people to engage with the Torah. Like, that's the switcheroo. And I'm flashing to a great Rebbe who's not a rabbi in the Jewish recent past in the grand scheme. I'm thinking of Harvey Milk and his whole idea of, I'm here to recruit you. That's what we're saying. And it's, by the way, it's not that I, Lex, or you, Dan, are here to recruit you. Like, we don't have that part. We're not elected office holders like Harvey Milk was. I want a philosophy collectively of, we're here to recruit you to apply to all yous, to all, that sounds like yous guys or something, to every individual you that is part of the tapestry of Jewish life. That ethos of, I'm here to recruit you. Your Torah not only could play a role in our future, but must. Like, without it, we are impoverished as a people. We're worse off. That's how I feel. So we're here to recruit you, and really, let's all be here to recruit one another and elevate the Torah of one another. So we're going to close on that note. I really just can't say enough how grateful I am to everybody who listens to this podcast ever, but also who came to Shavuot Live, whether it was for 10 minutes or for 10 hours. It is incredible to share revelation in many forms with all of you and receive it from so many of you. And on that front, in the interest of receiving more of your revelation, we want to hear from you. We greatly appreciate when you send us notes and let us know your own Torah, your own takes on our podcast, and your own thoughts on the future of Judaism. So please do that, and here are all the different ways you can do so. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com. Third, there are our email addresses at dan@JudaismUnbound.com and lex@JudaismUnbound.com. You can send to either, both of us, whatever you want. And the last request we'd make is one that Dan made at the top, but which I'll echo, which is we really, really are deeply appreciative of any amount of financial donation that you can make to ensure that this work continues. It isn't just about our organization, as we've said, but we do think our organization has a role to play in the co-creation of this Jewish future. So if you can send us a few bucks, you just do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time one-off gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.